Tom Scott is terrified by it.
I did not expect to have a minor existential crisis.
Steve Kaufman is amazed by it.
How can ChatGPT be used in these various areas?
But now we're going to find out if ChatGPT can understand and speak Latin. I'm Luke, and this is polýMATHY. So here it goes. Loquerisne latine, ita ego latine loqui possum, it says. So I've actually used ChatGPT to see if it understands Latin and even can write in Latin before, and I have, and I've had some opinions, but let's see how it does today. So far, loquerisne latine, ita ego latine loqui possum. Of course, it doesn't write the macrons. I wouldn't necessarily expect it to be that, professional or, good at what it should do, but, this is certainly better than nothing. Loquerisne latine, ita ego latine loqui possum. Quidaccidit anno 180 post Christum natum? It responds, anno 180 post Christum natum, Vesuvius, mons ignivomus in Italia, subito erupit. So far, not so bad. A mons ignivomus is in fact a way to say a volcano, a fire-vomiting mountain. Subito erupit, it suddenly erupted. Eructatio magna lapidum, cineris et puro cumuli facta est, quae perterritos inhabitantes in Vicinia perterruit. So far this all looks pretty okay, talking about the large eruption. Inculae qui eruptionem evasissent. So eruptionem with a Z, it looks like it's getting that from Italian, I suppose. In domos et tabernas portas obstruxerunt. So they barricaded into the houses and shops with in quod cinis crebris impetus omnia obtegebat, because the ash covered everything. Crebris impetus? Impetus, is this supposed to be a genitive? Is the crebris supposed to go with cinis? It's in the wrong case if that's the idea. Tragica eventus multos homines necavit. So eventus is masculine, so tragicus eventus would be better. Multos homines necavit. Killed many people. Et opida et villas vastavit. And devastated towns and villas. Haec eruptio, with the Z again, it's funny, Vesuvii est una ex maiorum et notabilium eruptionum in historia Europae. If you fix the spelling of eruptio, then it would be a bit better. So far, this is not great Latin. It's communicating with a lot of Latin words, and I can see what it's trying to say, but some things just are not how one would say these things. Dic mihi de te, quis es? Ego sum ChatGPT, magnus modus linguarum aperitum, what? Qui ab OpenAI studio est instructus. So I am the large language model, that's what this is. Aperitum, I think that means apertum, because aperitum wouldn't work. Quia OpenAI studio est instructus has been put together with zeal. Okay. Ego sum computatrum programmatum. Computatrum is a very common word in modern Latin. It's not a very good one though. Computatorium, from the adjective computatorius is a much better term for computer. So computatrum, please don't use that anymore. Computatorium is a much better term in case you're thinking about those kinds of things. So ego sum computatrum programmatum. I am a computer of programs. Maybe it means computer program. Maybe does it mean programmatum to mean programma? Has a kind of regularized form. I don't like it. Ut responderem ad varias questiones. Now there are long marks? Is it imitating my long marks? Is it learning from me? Oh my god, the machines are learning. So questiones, this is wrong because it needs to be spelled questiones with the letter A. Another thing that's wrong here is actually the word question. So quaestio doesn't mean a question. Quaestio means something that you are trying to understand. The best analogy is the Italian word questione. Questione doesn't mean question in Italian. Domanda means question in Italian. And the word for question in Latin doesn't really exist, which we'll get to in a moment. So quaestio is a problem. Quaestio is a problem. It's something you're trying to find a response to, an answer to, a solution to. It's something you're trying to find a solution to, or something to fulfill something. It's not a question in the English or the question French sense. The way to say question in Latin, if we need to use a noun for it, would be a rogatum or an interrogatum, and maybe a few other words. But really we use a circumlocution for this, which is id quod rogem, that which I might ask, or something like habes quid roges, do you have something that you might ask, and so forth. So ad varias quaestiones, ad varia rogata, interrogata, that would sound better in this case. So there's no direct word for question. We have to use different expressions in different ways, which makes sense. That's how every language works. There's not necessarily a direct word-for-word translation for everything. Et offerem, that word doesn't exist. There's offerem. Informationem, that's not a word. Information doesn't have a direct analog in Latin either. In varias tempestates scientiarum, in various storms of knowledges, artium of arts, historiarum of histories, et reliquarum, and of the rest of the things. Ego non sum persona, I am not a mask, sed programmatum informaticum. Yeah, it looks like it's using programmatum to be some kind of regularized form, but an informatic program. Using informaticus is very much an Italianism or a kind of a modern Englishy-ism. And programmatum regularized in this way, I don't agree with. Quod significat non posse habere propriam personam aut identitatem, which means not to be able to have a proper or one's own mask or identity. There is no term for identitas in Latin. That is a neologism that, as far as I know, very few people use because it's not really a part of the Latin language. There are other ways to express identity. This is not it. And persona can be used for a person in a very limited sense. Persona means mask. After that, it means a character in a play, because each mask that the characters would wear on the stage looks different. So that's not very good. Se gaudio quod possum tibi auxiliari, but I rejoice because I can be of help to you. So not definitely not excellent Latin. Though I'm very grateful to you, ChatGPT, for your telling me these things. Quid ego ita respondia. Ed ego gaudio me posse tecum garrire. Val de placet, siabes aliquas quaestiones, vol sivis loqui de aliquare, scribe et respondebo quantum possum. This is actually okay. Val de placet, siabes aliquas quaestiones, let's do something different. Vel sivis loqui de aliquare, or if you want to talk about something, scribe et respondebo quantum possum. So write and I will respond as much as I can. This is fine. This sounds much more like a normal modern Latin speaker. By the way, if you want to see more of my chats in Latin and possibly even ancient Greek, if I get around to it, with this fascinating machine, then check out the future videos that are going to be on Scorpio Martianus. Quod homines habitant Romae anno centesimo post Christum natum, esti ficere dicere numerum exactum hominum qui habitabant Romae in anno centesimo post Christum natum, quae non sunt census data aetat illa, quae plene et accurate numerum populi Romae describunt. So it's difficult to say the exact number hominum of people qui habitabant Romae in anno, we don't need the in, centesimo post Christum natum. Quia non sunt census data aetat illa, bi aetatis illius, quae plene, fully, et accurate, for some reason the macron, and accurately, numerum populi Romae describunt. That's essentially fine. Tamen, historici putant, however, historians think, quod Roma in tempore illo erat metropolis. So this is where it gets to be not good Latin anymore. Putant quod, that's not Latin. That is a slightly different language called Late Latin. Yes, it's part of a general corpus of Latin literature, but it's not the idiom of what we call Latin, which is essentially classical Latin. It's a change to the grammar that is not allowed. So it's a part of literature that's closely associated with classical Latin, being Late Latin. You can find it in, say, the Vulgate Bible, but it's not quite the same thing. Putant quod, no, you can't do that. Roma in tempore illo erat metropolis, et multi homines ex omnibus partibus imperii Romani illuc confluxerunt. That's fine, and many people from all the parts of the empire, of the Roman Empire, flowed together thither. Very nice. Dicuntur inter quinque et decem miliones hominum in imperio Romano habitasse in aetate illa. In the Roman Empire to have lived in that age. This is an okay sentence. Et propter status Romae ut caput imperii, propter status, propter statum, needs to be something. It's not statuses, it's not the plural. Magnum numerum hominum illi capitasse est probabile. Okay, so it's getting around. So far, it can answer some basic questions. It could probably answer quite a bit on history. Let's see how it answers this. Quando Graecia capta est? Graecia, sicut regiones geographicae multis gentibus habitatae, saepe variis populis subacta est. Tamen si de subactio Graeciae a Romanis locimur, Graecia fuit capta gradualiter a Romanis in bellis Macedonicis, quae a Romanis contra reges Macedoniam gerebantur. Alright, so Greece, quae a Romanis contra reges Macedoniam gerebantur, which, being these wars, were waged by the Romans against the kings Macedonia. So there's an error, it should be reges Macedoniae. Interesting. That's not bad. So the machine can definitely talk about facts, certainly history. I would expect it to be able to talk something about history, certainly history within the Greco-Roman sphere. It does so with an okay usage of grammar, but there are weird mistakes like reges Macedoniam and some others that we saw earlier. So if you're looking to translate or do anything from English into Latin, I don't recommend it because you're probably at this point, at this stage, which is in March of 2023, the machine's understanding of Latin isn't good enough to produce good Latin. It will do occasional weird things because it's a large language model. That means it'll be able to imitate language based on the information that's been put into it. And I assume also with user experience, but it's taking from different sources. It doesn't have enough of a sense of style to know not to use late Latin, for example. Whereas with modern English or other modern languages, there is probably hundreds of thousands of times more available information in a very specific dialect of, say, English, which is modern English of the 21st century. So it's not going to sound strange or to use things that are grammatically out of place. Not for English or Italian or German, but for Latin it does, and it gets stuff that's just plain wrong that never occurs in Latin. Let's try something a bit more complicated. Fuit ne Cicero stoicus, Marcus Tullius Cicero non erat stoicus, sed erat academicus. Generally, this seems to be responding well to certain things. This isn't too bad. I use a lot of strange things that are kind of unique neologisms that I would expect people who don't know Latin very well to use. Not really good Latin style. It definitely can communicate in Latin, and somebody who knows Latin well will be able to understand exactly what the machine is saying. And this is also better than what I'd seen a few months ago, where the verb was always the second thing. I guess someone along the line told it to learn the Latin syntax. I talked about that in a different video. And that is great. So I'm glad that the syntax is generally pretty okay. Some grammar issues here and there. But if you want to be someone who can actually train ChatGPT to communicate in good classical Latin, then you're going to need this video sponsor, the Ancient Language Institute. And that's because ALI is bringing ancient language pedagogy into the 21st century, taking advantage of excellent digital tools that introduce you to tons of video and audio in the target language before you even show up in the online classroom. Your instructors at ALI make the most of time in class, troubleshooting difficult passages and concepts, and guiding you to conversational ability and reading fluency in Latin, Ancient Greek, Biblical Hebrew, and Old English. Registration for the summer term closes April 15th, with beginner level cohorts starting this summer in Latin, Ancient Greek, and Old English. Additionally, ALI offers a wide variety of intermediate and advanced classes in Anglo-Saxon, Latin, and Greek. And speaking of Greek, Join ALI instructors this summer in Eugene, Oregon for a 10-day Greek language immersion Bible camp. For more information, visit ancientlanguage.com. Thanks so much to Ancient Language Institute. Now let's ask some more philosophical questions. Quae philosophia optima est omnium? What's the best philosophy of them all? Oh, I've got to think about this one. This is difficult for it. Oh man, the anticipation. Difficile est dicere quae philosophia sit optima omnium. It's difficult to say which philosophy is the best of all. Good usage of sit. Oh no, load failed. Well, that's very interesting. Oh, and it's red too. Exclamation point. Oh no. Quae homines ponunt sibi ipsis, that people place to themselves. Verum est quod philosophiae diversas partes veritatis et sapiente contineant. So the Platonic philosophies, for a third example, contains ideam unum. So ideam unum. So the word for idea is consilium. Idea, using that in Latin, is just not recommendable. So consilium unum, but its unum is neuter and ideam feminine, so that's really weird. Quae universum explicare conatur, ergo quod philosophia optima sit dependet ex hominibus ipsis et load failed. Not sure why it failed. Actually, you know what? I'm going to go ahead and say, what do you like about this response? Reasonably well explained, impartial, and interesting. Yeah, it was fine. Regenerate response. What does that do? You don't need to regenerate it, man. I think that was pretty effective as it was, but let's see what comes out of it. Oh, this is interesting. Actually, I don't like the Latin as much. It's a similar kind of example. It's a little bit less complete than the last one, but since I'm really picking on the quality of the Latin more than its ability to respond, which is usually fine, we have respondendi, so that's an interesting typographical error. At least this is the right superlative, difficillimum, not difficilissimo or something incorrect, so that's fine. Est tamen communis opinio inter philosophos, quod valde importante est, which is very important. Ooh, that's not good. There's no word for important in Latin. There are different circumlocutions for different situations. In this case, quod magni momenti est, which is of great moment. That's the way to say importance in the most generic sense, which is what's used here. Et utinam sapiamus, eam quam proxime possimus. So, kind of breaks down. It's fine. We also have the inconsistent use of non-J, and here J. Maybe it's learning from me because I'm writing to it with J's. You write in J's too. Here's my video on the J's. Definitely use J's in Latin. You don't have to, but I recommend them, and that video shows you why. Let's see now how this large language model does translating Latin into English. Potesne hoc mihi reddere Anglicae. This is from Livy, book 24, if I got it right. Can you please provide more context for the text you have shared? It appears to be a passage from a historical or philosophical work, but without more information, it is difficult to determine the exact source and provide an accurate translation. I guess meaning that rather than actually translating it, it wants to find some translation that already exists that it has cataloged. I don't know, I'm just guessing. Okay, I guess it was just stalling because it already has something ready. When the Roman army returned from Campania to Bruttium, Hanno, with the aid and guidance of the Bruttians, attempted to capture the Greek cities in the area. The Romans were more easily able to maintain their alliance with the Bruttians because they saw them as having become supporters of the Carthaginians, whom the Romans both hated and feared. The first city they attempted to take was Rhegium, but several days were spent there in vain. This looks pretty fine. I don't know the passage. I chose something at random that I didn't know just to kind of see like, oh, okay. So I could definitely get a translation out of this. It could probably, just seeing this, I think this could be very helpful if, I don't know, I don't really need this, but people who don't know Latin as well, if they wanted to get a sense of context, maybe very quickly in their native language, and they were to ask ChatGPT to translate a passage or something, or maybe a phrase, something that just, is puzzling them, it could at least give some idea of what it means. and that might help the person in their translation or their comprehension of the text. I see this as a very useful thing to get through sticking points. We've all had them. Last time I really had them was a few years ago when I first started reading Apuleius. I'm very comfortable with Apuleius now, but I can imagine having found something like this useful where I could say, could you just, what does this mean in English? And then have the ChatGPT give me some idea of it. It might be wrong, but at least it might get me on the right track. Let's take a bit from the first eclogue and ask it to hoc vertere Anglicae quae so. Quae so, right? Quae so. Translate this into English, please. It's thinking. Could you please translate this to English? It says. Okay. Translated my translation. It understands that very clearly, though. O Meliboeus, God has given us this leisure. For he shall always be my God, and I shall often dip a tender lamb from my flock in his altar. Let's see, imbuet. Well, that's not exactly what is meant by that. A lamb will often paint, imbuere, will often imbue its blood on an altar. He allowed me to play with my cattle, as you see. That's not what it means. To play with my cattle, as you see, and write of what I would with a rustic quill. And says this is Virgil's poem Eclogues, Eclogue 1, lines 1 to 5. And lines 1 to 5? No, it's the first few lines are Ti tu re tu patulai regoban sub tegmine fagi, and so forth. So this is lines like 6 to 10, more or less. So that's incorrect, which is interesting. It's also interesting some of the things that are wrong. I happen to know this better, so I can immediately say, oh no, this is off, which is a bit better than the Livy example, which I wasn't bothering to examine. So he allowed me to play with my cattle. No, he allowed me ille mea serrare boes ut cernis sed ipsum ludere quae velem calamo permissit agresti. So ille permissit, he, this is a you would imagine about Augustus, ille permissit, he permitted meas boes errare, he allowed my cattle to roam, ut cernis, as you see, et ipsum, and allowed me myself, ludere quae velem calamo agresti, allowed me to play as much as I like on my rustic flute. So, with a rustic quill. So, it's interesting that it knew where it came from. It didn't have a translation, I guess, available. So it used some kind of translation matrix, but it got some stuff wrong. Of course, this is poetry, and the lines being altered like this may have confused it. In any case, these are really important things. These are very obvious to anyone who knows Latin. You don't even have to know the poem well to get right. So it's getting these things wrong. So you can't depend on this for translation. You can't depend on translation, certainly not into Latin, and definitely not from Latin into English. This is probably good enough of a tool to help you, if you know Latin to some degree, to get through some sticking points. Don't use this for tattoos. By the way, I never translate anything for a tattoo because I don't want the responsibility. Please enjoy your tattoos any way you like, but context is so important. I think it's way better for someone just if you really want a tattoo, you got dedication. Learn Latin to some basic level of fluency. Just use Familia Romana, get all in there, and then you'll be able to read a poem like this and understand it better and translate it better than this machine can do. And also make your own tattoos, which will be a lot better. And then you have, then it's all on your shoulders instead of having someone else giving a translation and being dependent on them. So that was my first time using ChatGPT to analyze it for you, because you out there have been asking me for a long while now, is it any good? I would say it's not bad. It's definitely better than Google Translate, but it still makes grammatical errors that first semester Latin students wouldn't make. It also has a very broad sense of things. It's able to communicate about things in philosophy that, I don't know all those facts. I could look them up, Obviously, ChatGPT has access to that information and is able to composite it into a response. So if you just want someone to talk to in Latin, it might be a great practicing resource, because it is a great way to then you formulate your questions, and if you're having a fun time with it, then that's really useful. By the way, I'm going to be doing future videos on Scorpio Martianus where I chat with it, but I want to know from you, what kind of thing should I ask? So put comments down below this video and let me know what kind of questions you'd like me to ask, and I'll do that and look for those future videos over on Scorpio Martianus. I might even do some in ancient Greek as well. When it comes to translating from Latin into English, we can see it's not necessarily reliable. It's going to get stuff incorrect, which is pretty consistent with the same kinds of errors I saw in the way that it formed the Latin too. So it's going to get a lot of stuff right, but it's also going to get a lot of stuff wrong. If you're translating a whole bunch of stuff and you want to start with something, I could see some utility. It reminds me a little bit of maybe a situation like, say, paralegal. Right? So I've never been in a law office, but there are lawyers and paralegals as far as I understand, right? So the lawyers might assign a paralegal, do all of this research work for me, or, writing up of documents. And then the lawyer is the one that will take all of that and then, fix, I assume, which would be rather few errors, relatively few errors, maybe on this kind of level, and turn it into something that's more presentable and ultimately legal. That's why they're paralegal. They're almost there. I don't know. I don't know anything about the law, just whatever I've seen on Better Call Saul. It's a really interesting tool that way. If I ever had a lot to translate, or maybe a sticking point where I just like, what is this passage trying to say? That just totally baffled me. It might be nice to help, give me a picture, and then I could focus zooming in on the thing that was really troubling me. I probably wouldn't need it to do that for myself, but as a learning tool, it could be of use to lots of people. So that's interesting. But you cannot depend on it for good Latinity. It has macrons weirdly in there. It has spelling errors, spelling inconsistencies. It's interesting. It's very cool. I'm glad it exists. I think it could go farther. Like I said earlier, the quality of the Latin a few months ago, when I first looked at it, when someone said, hey, you got to check out this ChatGPT, it's got Latin, I did, and had, subject, verb, whatever, and it was, okay. I was able to talk back and forth with it pretty much like this. But now the syntax is better. So if it's evolving, if it's getting better as a large language model, that's fantastic. That's really good. That could be very interesting. It has a long way to go to be as good as what I assume it can do in modern languages. There's really nothing that this can do that would fully replace abilities or occupations like translation or teaching. But as a supplement, the way that Google Translate can be used in all kinds of contexts, at least for modern languages, Latin not so much. The way that tools out there do exist is an interesting way to interact. And if you're just looking for something to practice typing Latin with, it might be of great use. It's not necessarily the most interesting thing to talk to. A real person writing messages back and forth, that's a great way to practice your language learning skills, especially at an earlier stage where you're not comfortable speaking, but you want to, the formulate, you want the practice, and having a little bit of stimulus of another entity, even though it's not really an entity, of a large language model responding to you, that is potentially very useful. I myself and other people, like say Daniel Pedersen, we learned to speak Latin a little bit by talking to people, but mostly just by talking to ourselves. Unfortunately, with ancient languages, and to a lesser extent modern languages, often that's something you have to do. You have to kind of incorporate the language into your own psyche to fill up all of the hours of the day. I have a video I'm going to do soon telling you about a technique I use that I really recommend for Latin and ancient Greek and really any other language that you want to learn, so you can maximize your own ability to teach yourself the language, to teach yourself to become more conversational in a language. Something like ChatGPT, that could certainly work into that. In any case, ChatGPT, really interesting stuff, super hard work that all the people who have made it have put into it. I can see all that, and I hope it becomes an even better tool for all of us to enjoy. Of course, if you want to learn Latin for realsies, Ancient Language Institute, that is this video sponsor, and I highly recommend them. Wonderful colleagues of mine over there. And thanks so much to every one of my Patreon supporters. I really hope you enjoyed the video. Valete.